The EU, just like the US federal government, is so bad that it makes me defend one of the most distasteful corporations on the market: Apple. Because make no mistake, in the European Commission versus Apple dispute, the EU is the much bigger and much more dangerous devil. I mean, after all, Apple just sells you overpriced crap which you can refuse to buy, but the EU shoves down your throat utterly retarded laws that ruin your national economy, national identity, and national sovereignty. Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of Freedom Alternative Research and Analysis. Alright, it's been a while since I've made a research and analysis episode anyway. So, as I'm sure you all know by now, the European Commission decided to force the Irish state to steal an extra 13 billion euros from Apple Incorporated because the EU said so. The Irish government, however, does not want to do that, and the Irish law was not broken, and Apple is adamant that it did follow the legal system to the T. But nevertheless, the European Commission just showed once again that the so-called subsidiarity principle that allegedly underpins the European Union of Soviet Socialist Republics exists only in the mind of academicians, but definitely not in reality, or where the will of the unelected bureaucrats supersedes the will of the democratically elected governments. And this applies including in the tax policy department. To make things worse, the EU isn't even demanding taxes in the future, but retroactively, which basically means that the Commission just decided that whatever laws Ireland has had, those simply don't matter, because the Commission overlords know better. Now, isn't that great? Now, there are two main reasons for which this scandal matters a lot more than it would seem at a first glance. The first is the perversion of language, and the second is, of course, the issue of sovereignty. So let's get through both of them a little bit, and then we'll provide a bit of an overview. First of all, the Commission's communique is quite literally Orwellian. The Commission's motivation for this decision is that Ireland broke the state aid regulations of the common market, which were put in place to prevent subsidies that create highly unfair competition within the common market. Now, whether those regulations are a good idea or not is a separate discussion, but what is not a separate discussion is whether any tax deal of any kind constitutes aid or not. And the answer is that it doesn't. Our language and thinking has been corrupted almost beyond repair by the very, very long stream of economic socialists who've been running the European economies since the end of World War II. These days, not being stolen from has become to be seen as aid or subsidies. And that, my friends, is utterly insane. Now, whether Apple's tax deal with the Irish government was fair or not is quite frankly of little importance. As far as I'm concerned, this should concern the Irish governments and their voters, and most definitely not the unelected, unaccountable, and economically illiterate schmucks from Brussels. What is of much greater importance is to avoid failing for the EU's and the leftist agitprop that being stolen from at a lower rate is somehow aid or subsidy. Most economic departments in Europe today treat the state as if it's some sort of a deity to whom everyone owes everything, when in reality the state is basically a glorified organization that differs very little from a criminal gang. And nowhere is this truer than in Europe, a continent riddled with economic socialism. Alright, let's go to sovereignty. Now, such a decision, if it will stand, has the potential to render obsolete any pretense that the countries trapped in this socialist bloc have any sort of autonomy over their own tax affairs. The powers that be in Brussels, Frankfurt and Berlin have been trying endlessly in the last 8 years to supersede the democratically elected government's ability to set up their own tax policies. Most of the time they failed, but they did score some victories too, such as the fact that now one is forced to pay the VAT in his or her own country of origin rather than the country of the company. So for instance, if I want to buy something from Luxembourg, I no longer pay the 15% VAT rate of Luxembourg, but the VAT rate for that product in my own country, or the country where I'm making the purchase from. In addition to that, the EU also forced companies to collect VAT for things that were not taxed in the past, and also at the rate of the country of origin of the consumer. One such example is Patreon pledges. No wonder the supporters of this channel have slowly moved towards using other venues to supporting me and get the hell out from Patreon. If this decision will stand, it will mean the end of the ability of any country that is unfortunate enough to be a member of this club to set up its own tax policies. And in addition to that, any past tax policies are also open season for the EU to meddle with because, let me remind you, this war between the Commission and Apple is for retroactive taxes. So not only is the EU changing Ireland's future tax code, but it's also changing its past. And if that's not scary for you, you're probably not paying attention. Now, many of you will probably say that it is unfair for Apple to be taxed the way it was taxed in Ireland, but that point is of little to no relevance. As far as I'm concerned, fiscal equity is only good if it brings lower taxes. Otherwise, the hell with fiscal equity. But even so, the decision over Ireland's tax code should be made by the Irish government that is elected by the Irish people. That is the issue, first and foremost. For the Americans watching this, imagine if a Buenos Aires-led coalition came in and superseded the US federal government when the said federal government decided to cut taxes to make the US industry competitive. It sounds ridiculous, isn't it? Well, that's exactly what's happening here right now. Unelected, unaccountable, and socialist foreign bureaucrats dictating to a sovereign nation on how that nation should treat its investors. Because let's not forget that Apple has been investing in Ireland for over 30 years and the Cork area is as prosperous as it is today, largely thanks to Apple Incorporated. And no matter how things went on with Apple, even when things were really bad for them, they stayed there and created wealth and growth in an area where nobody else was investing. Also, Apple is one of the reasons Ireland made a miraculous recovery when the country collapsed Greece-style 7 years ago. When investors were fleeing Ireland, Apple was expanding its operations, hiring more people in the area. These are all facts that provide a radically different context than the one painted by the socialists du jour, by the bureaucrats in the Commission, and by the lolbertarians for whom the so-called fiscal equity is a lot more important than the goals of any economy, namely to deliver prosperity for individuals as opposed to the maximal socialist state, and even more important than reality itself. Though that shouldn't be surprising, however, since these are largely the same people who agree with Juncker that borders are a bad idea, whilst at the same time erected borders on their own property. So, to sum up, the European Commission versus Apple is a competition case that is jurisprudence creating in and of itself. Based on how this case ends, we will know whether being a supporter of the European Union will still be merely an inherently wrong idea or outright a mental disorder. Because if this goes down the EU's way, then supporting the EU from that point on cannot be anything else than pure mental disorder. The EU should never have the power to decide how national governments write their tax policies or how they treat foreign investors, especially foreign investors from allied countries. Because, it's not like Apple is an Iranian company or something, for crying out loud. In fact, given the level of cuckoldry in the European Union, if Apple had been an Iranian company, this decision would have gone down differently, that's for sure. The inherent anti-Americanism amongst the EU elites is a well-known disorder that sooner or later will bring a lot more problems than there currently are on this old continent. Anyway, with all of that being said, thank you for watching and for your continuous support of this channel. I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.